Hello, this is Chris Parker, and I just had a conversation with Araz Najarian, and she is a partner with the ELP network. And we got into psychometrics. And we talked about psychometrics in the concept of strategizing. And I took a SPI, a strategizing preference indicator, I think it was called, and we unpacked that about me as well. So we talked about what are psychometrics, how can it be used in leadership team dynamics, how can it make, or these small teams make better decisions in their strategizing process, and then we dove into my own preferences. It was really cool. So, Araz, why would it be valuable for people to listen to this conversation?
I would say it's valuable because we also talked about the principles of like where and how to use psychometrics, and I think that that was a really important outcome of a recent conversation we had with our network, and then how you could actually apply those principles in terms of being able to use psychometrics within a leadership team to build more understanding of your decision-making dynamics, about how you work together, and how you lead the organization.
And sometimes psychometrics can be criticized for different things, but what I found really great about this conversation is, this is like an expert practitioner talking about how to do this well, and what, some of these principles on what you shouldn't do as well. So it's really, I thought found it was very, very interesting and rich. And
Welcome to the Business Simplicity Podcast, where Chris Parker explores how leaders cut through complexity to accelerate strategy, execution, and growth with calm, clarity, and confidence.
welcome back to the Business Simplicity Podcast. This is Chris Parker, and I'm having a conversation with Araz Najarian, and she's a partner with the ELP network. And I'm associated with ELP as well, and I've done some projects with them over the years. And they are really working, their tagline is realizing breakthroughs. And I know them for working with management teams and executive teams, particularly in scale up, change, large strategic shift moments. And in a moment, I'll let Araz share deeper into what ELP is doing. But recently, part of the network had a conversation about psychometrics, and that was hosted by Araz and Michael Newman, another associated member with ELP. And I thought it was really fascinating, and some of the insights that came back, I just couldn't resist. But then said, "Hey, Araz, can we please talk about this, and can we unpack this, because I want to go deeper." And I love having these conversations because this is what I learn and connect. And so we're going to dive into psychometrics in the context of business leadership, strategizing, decision making, and hopefully when not to use them, or how not to use them as well. And soon we'll define what psychometrics actually are. But Araz, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks.
Maybe if you want to express a bit deeper about ELP, and what are the type of work you do
Yeah.
there, and then we'll turn the corner and to figure out what psychometrics is all about.
Super, super. Well, I joined ELP quite some time ago, actually, but it was in the midst of I don't know, the first, according to me, the first financial crisis of the 2000s period. So that was back in 2008. And I was also at a period where, I was searching for what my next step was going to be. And a mentor of mine from the ISIC network that I was involved with, he said, maybe before jumping into a single company in the private sector, why don't I introduce you to the partners of ELP Network? This is Fernando Lanzer. I don't know if you ever met Fernando, by the way. But he said, I'll introduce you to Nick Van Heck and to Tom Cummings at the time, who were both partners. And why don't you actually try that out? And what really attracted me in terms of why I joined, but then why I ended up kind of staying so many years later and then joining and becoming part of the partnership, was when they created the company, there was kind of two main drivers for why they wanted to found it. One was asking the question, why is it that some organizations manage to stay relevant, continue growing for like 100 plus years, and others, fade away? What is it that actually really makes the difference? And the research that's also now been kind of renewed a couple of times showed that It's nothing to do with kind of industry differences. It's not like macroeconomic factors or external factors. Even if you look at kind of, companies across different markets and different geographies, it all comes down to how are you able to stay connected to the outside world? How do you continue to kind of create value for others and value in the eyes as perceived by the customer and value beyond just price? Price is a way of then showing, I value, but there's other things, there's other attributes for which you're valuing. And then if we're able to, successfully organize ourselves to kind of make money so that we can pay people and we can pay our suppliers and we can keep reinvesting in the business, continuing that kind of pattern of renewal, that's actually what's going to help fuel that growth. And to enable that, they started to see that actually some of the practices in organizations were being run in a very disconnected way. So if we're going to run our strategy process, all of the, senior people go away with, and we do this egghead type of, sorry to put it in that way, but,
Mm.
this very brainy exercise. And then we come back and we tell everybody, here's what we're going to do. Here's why we're going to do it. Here's what you're supposed to do. So it was very much strategy as execution, which is, more and more we see that actually really does not work. Strategy is not some static, yeah, you will document some things, but it's actually strategizing. It's strategy, as learning. So it's, learning from that. And on the other hand, if you look at a lot of what was being done in kind of executive leadership development, people would go away on these wonderful, offsites or go on like a safari and a kind of a leadership journey, have profound insights. Yet when you'd come back and then you'd look at, whether you'd look at engagement scores or you'd look at, great places to work or any other kind of sentiment, it was in some cases abysmal in terms of how people in the company were feeling. How do I feel about my manager? How do I feel about the context? Do I feel that I belong here? Do I feel I'm invited? And if we're creating that kind of workplace, it's very, that's a workforce that you have to kind of drag along to get results out of versus everybody showing up every day, so excited, feeling I'm ready to really contribute. And that's essentially where we try to play, is to support that kind of renewal of growth and bring, strategizing and leadership together.
I mean,
Try to keep it short.
yeah, no. Do you guys find a causality from that second order of let's call it engagement with that 100-year ambition of healthy company? I guess I hope that's true, but I don't know. Like, because like in order, like if the if the intention is what
Yeah.
makes these long-term sustainable healthy companies, connection with the outside, which is a leadership action, and then in
Yeah.
strategizing and engaging, those two things are the main bodies, I guess, of concepts that contribute to long-term sustainability, do you think?
Well, what we looked at is we said that those dynamics are actually they're quite leading and
Mhm.
they have quite a heavy weight in terms of the actual ability to be able to continue to find new ways of creating value.
Yeah.
Because the world around you also changes. So, and you see that with companies that have been successful, but when either competition comes along or new technology comes along, or something happens around you and you're unable to adapt it or to be kind of at the forefront of kind of making and creating it, then it can actually be you're in a difficult situation in terms of you're playing kind of catch up. And I think what we're always continuously doing, in terms of our connection to academia, is to kind of continue renewing that research, but also research into the practices. So how can some of those practices that are less, you cannot tangibly measure them the same way that you can measure certain times as financial metrics or assets that we say that we could leverage and so forth. But those practices will, they'll give a sign of whether, are we actually healthy and on the path
Yeah.
that's gonna eventually also show up in our financials. Did I answer your question? Did I understand?
Yeah, I think so. And you mentioned academic because it's my association with ELPs where I met Amy Edmondson from Harvard around
Yeah.
psychological safety and let's call it positive failing, her more recent work. And I remember when I first met Nick Van Heck, the partner you mentioned, was, well, probably 20 years ago when I was with LeasePlan in an executive program, and simplifying some of these concepts like value creation versus value capture. Those were, I think people talk about that a lot nowadays, but it was to separate those intents. Um, it was profound for me at that time.
Yeah.
So that's part of the work. Would you mind diving into that and talking about value creation
Absolutely.
versus value capture? And then
Yeah.
I'm curious, how does psychometrics fit into all this?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very good
Mm,
question. I mean, in terms of then, and I'm just thinking, if we had also like Paul Verdun here, if we had Nick, if we had a few of the others, I mean, this
mm,
we could do hours and hours on this because it's really one of our favorite things. And I think when you dive into also value creation, it's also very it's based on the eyes of the customer. So you're not going to get a something that you can kind of consistently and easily measure necessarily because it is very much a perception. And where I've seen mostly the value of kind of decoupling those two, because if you look at, for example, Michael Porter, a few years back, he started to also talk a lot about shared value. And for a lot of people, that was also eye-opening, and I understand why, because then you decouple also value creation value purely from shareholder value
mm.
in terms of the obligation of registered businesses or stock listed in terms of what you have towards your shareholders. But there is what I like about value creation, value capturing, and how it also then separates and shows, well, those stakeholders have potentially sometimes competing interests. There are
Mm.
businesses that make a lot of money, that are highly profitable, that are making their shareholders very happy, that maybe have a customer base that isn't so satisfied. And they may feel like, well, we don't really have an alternative or an easy alternative, and we're a little bit stuck. Uh,
Monopolies, basically,
Monopolies, yeah.
an
And so
obvious.
then what happens is that eventually, at some point when there is competition, then you start losing your top line because the captive, customers you had, if the switching costs are, if you take Porter's classical analysis, if those switching costs are down, or if there's an advantage that, somebody else starts to have, or a patent expires, or whatever it is that could then happen, then as soon as your revenue starts going, well, then you might start playing with your bottom line, restructuring, buying revenue by, through acquisitions. But you're not fundamentally looking at, who is my customer, what am I serving, and how am I, looking at value
Yeah.
for them. Um,
Yeah. Can you tell me a bit of a story of the types of engagements, or maybe give an example of engagement when you're talking about um, sustainable business sort of, ambition, helping that organization assume its leadership, connecting to the outside world while, strategizing to engage, uh, let's call it the rest of the company, the whole company, um, and keeping an eye on this value capture, value creation. Is this really the essence of the engagements that ELP would step into and help an organization with?
yeah, it's definitely one of the iconic pieces because, and the reason why is because, you talked about our tagline, realizing breakthroughs. Um, and for us also, it's realizing breakthroughs in the context of growth. And we also talk about something on our website like creating space for growth. And I think that's what a lot of us also in the network kind of connect to, is that we're looking at growth not purely as you may end up bigger, but that's not necessarily the purpose of the growth. Growth it's not just purely more of the same. Roger Martin talks a lot about, are we exploiting or are we exploring? So there's also the part of growth that's exploration, and that's very much transformative. So I think then the type of engagement we have that really depends on what's happening actually in the organization, and where is an entry point in terms of, based on where you are, where could we pick you up in that journey, and where would we actually want to go next. So in a lot of cases, I would say it does also start with the leadership team, because they are the ones that is setting the context. And I think one of the most kind of crucial things about, for leadership teams, and then I think this ties into then psychometrics, is some cases when you especially when you're preparing for, let's say we have an engagement, we're going to meet a team, we're going to have like an offsite together with them. Teams are doing offsites all the time. Now, before that, you want to talk to people. You want to get to know, who's all in this team, who's going to be there, how are they looking at the current situation. And one of the most, you know, oftentimes I've heard coming back from these interviews is this kind of feeling of doubt of like, well, I think we're more or less aligned on this topic, but I'm not really sure. Or, we have a plan, but I don't know. I don't know how they're feeling about it. And I see some behavior that I'm not really sure that they're walking the same path. There is this kind of underlying, like what's sitting under the surface that doesn't necessarily come up in the day-to-day business. It doesn't come up it's the things that are left unsaid, that we don't bring up in a management meeting because time is too short, or because of the reasons that Amy rightly points out in terms of interpersonal link, interpersonal risk that I take within a group. Can I actually bring something up and people are not going to perceive me that I'm being negative if I'm objecting to something, or if I'm saying I have a criticism for it, or if I'm bringing something up that's challenging, like, hey, maybe we should reconsider how we're actually doing this. Now, teams have offsites all the time. Not every offsite. Sometimes offsites become like an extended management meeting. And
Yeah.
I think that's also such a pity because those are like the only moments that we have as a leadership team to really
Mm.
actually create space for ourselves to surface all of those things that maybe we're not even conscious of, that are sitting underneath, and to get really aligned on where are we actually today? Because we start moving and then we all have a different, definition of what is actually the challenges that we're facing. Like, what are really the assets that we should be leveraging? How do you think that we should be doing that? And then some of that comes down to there are fundamentally different preferences and behaviors that we have of how we want to problem solve. And I think that's where I find, the conversation that we had a while back with the network on psychometrics so fascinating, because I think these teams are probably the ones who should be most preoccupied about how do I decide? Because you're taking decisions all the time. You're taking decisions on behalf of people. You have information coming at you, and you also have to enable a context for others to not continuously escalate decisions to you,
Yeah.
because you get no zero speed out of that. You want to make sure that decision making is also happening at the right level, that the right context is there. So I think that's where tools like, psychometrics, I think depending on how we use them, could actually be so powerful in a team setting, because we get a kind of a language to understand, why are you thinking that way? Or why is it that every time you make a presentation, you start, in this setup, because that's not the setup that I expect you to
Yeah.
be starting.
No,
Yeah.
um I was first introduced to psychometrics, well, I guess in the MBA, through DDA Marlier, but later when I was running an international project for Lease Plan,
Hmm.
um, we did run the Myers-Briggs type indicator
Yeah.
for the whole team, and it was really revealing, and it sort of peeled back another layer of understanding self, and through understanding self, you could also comprehend how others might experience me, and then I
Hmm.
and then I can also see people in a different lens. And when you start also understanding how different people's personalities shift by context, like if they are at work or at home, or if they're under stress and some sort of
Yeah.
shadow dimension of their personalities coming, um I think it creates a space of acceptance and sometimes forgiveness, because like, oh, that's who this person
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And even though they're behaving oddly here, I can see beyond the behavior of now, because I know there's this complex, amazing, human, um on this journey near me. And
Yeah.
no, I don't know, for me, the I've always been interested in these things, really to understand myself better.
Hmm.
And if there is a way of having a language that you can also orient with people as well, introvert, extrovert, and stuff. And but maybe can you give it a stab of what is psychometrics and what are some examples there? I mentioned Myers-Briggs, but there's a
Yeah.
whole, menagerie of different approaches
Yeah.
and concepts.
Chris, before I do that, can I also take the liberty that I ask you a question
Oh
back?
yeah, go. Yeah.
So, so when the first time that you actually also like what you just described, it also sounds to me like the first time you were introduced to something like an MBTI was in a kind of a team context.
Yes,
Yeah. And was that also then kind of you were guided through it?
absolutely. I think the first time was at Nairota, the MBA with
Uh-huh.
DDA
Yeah.
from
Mhm.
who's yeah a cousin of ELP, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, and that was then in the cohort of the MBA class, and the process was, it was described to us what we were doing. We were giving the assessment. After the assessment, it was described to us, and
Yeah.
we were also given a number of warnings as well.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so it was done, and I think I found that really interesting, and also because that was an MBA setting, so we were able to share, um, and it was a bonding thing. I think it was a bonding thing that we were like, oh, I understand you better now, understand
Yeah.
me better. And so then when I was tasked to create a company in Ireland, and we had about 50 people coming together, internals and externals, and we were recruiting people from all throughout lease plan who had never worked together before. I
Mm.
was seeking connection and understanding quickly. And we did some offsites. So we went actually back to Nairota. I remember that was there.
Nice.
And we did okay, this, talking about why we're here and who are we. And that was the first time I used it, this type of thing, for a team that I was responsible for.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, it was a conversation starter. I think that was the biggest
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was curious about that because it also I think so the first time that I was ever introduced to MBTI, um, it was not a good experience. And I
Mm,
think for me, part of it was because the debriefing was actually not done very well. So we couldn't like we didn't get out of it what you described getting out of it in terms of building kind of understanding, curiosity. It actually, I mean, it didn't go so bad in that direction, but it did run the risk of kind of, stereotyping and labeling. And it was later on where then I was in a different context with a different team that then I was reintroduced to, and I think it was still MBTI. I can't remember now if it was MBTI or if it was Insights, like it was another kind of a Jungian type of tool. And the debrief made such a difference in terms of being able to have the quality of conversation and to also have somebody who could give warnings in terms of like, why are we actually using this? What is it going to say about you? Keep in mind that it's a limited, like, no human can be boxed and completely categorized. I mean, we are way, way more complex, and everything that creates us is way more complex. And that's why I was curious because it sounds to me like also your first introduction, having had a good guide through that, actually brings benefit rather than, with any kind of tool, it's like it becomes kind of medicalized or a label, or you see like, I'm like this. And then we might feel, no, I'm so much more than, it's like, I'm so
no,
much
yeah,
more
no,
than Canadian or a female. And you know what I mean?
I certainly didn't feel boxed, and in mine, because I've taken it, and I've been involved in projects that have used it, even though I'm not MBTI certified, so I'm not a practitioner. I don't do it myself, but I've been in teams that have had trained practitioners. And for me, it's been very consistent over the years. So I'm an INTP. I'm in introvert, intuitive thinking perceiver as a natural state.
Yeah.
And I think the book that it was, like, What Color's Your Parachute, I think, was also based
Oh,
on
yeah. Yeah.
MBTI,
Yeah.
if you remember that. I don't know if it exists anymore.
Yeah. I
Um,
don't know if it's in print still, but
yeah, I don't know. I think it came out of it. I don't know, but it was. I also started to identify as it in a lot of ways, because that archetype is a bit, kind of an architect type. It's kind of a
Mhm.
visionary architect, problem solver.
Yeah.
Um, and that, I guess it also it gave me a, like, oh, okay, so I a validation, I guess. Like, oh,
Yeah.
like, oh, I feel comfortable in my skin when I hear those words. What I
Yeah.
also realized in work, I had trained myself to be a J, meaning a J.
Hmm. It's a
And so,
skill. You
yeah.
have
And
those
so
skills.
sometimes when I take it, and I noticed it because we're gonna talk about this SPI report
Yeah.
that I did, and I'm curious to see how we process that.
Yeah.
But I when I read through that, I think there's some J coming out of that as well.
Yeah.
And for people that don't know MBTI, the last little acronym, perceiving and judging, is basically, do you like to keep things very open, have a lot of
Mm,
options, or do you like to close and becoming very definitive? And in
yeah.
my normal life, I like keeping my options open everywhere. And then, but at work, I've had to learn that no, you got to make a decision,
Yeah.
and so maybe that was a survival response in the
Mm,
corporate world where having options open forever isn't always appreciated, so
yeah.
it's, yeah, there's a dynamic there. It's
Yeah. It's also a
and
very human thing is like, I mean, as humans, we do, a part of us wants to explore, has that, exploration. And there's another part where, yeah, I want to organize the world. I want to bring clarity. I want to bring stability. I want to, be able to take decisions and close things off.
yeah.
And we may have a preference, but, and I think that's where with, there's a difference between of I have a preference for something versus I have a skill, like, and I'm able to learn.
Mm.
And because sometimes people can have a preference and they can be completely incompetent in, that preference.
Oh
Of
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
if you are, if you like exploring options, you may be very poor at the quality of options that you actually explore. So I think that's also an important distinction. I mean, it's also for psychometrics overall. What I found interesting in the conversation we were having with the network was recognizing that all psychometric tools, even because, for example, MBTI is heavily criticized. Also because Young is also criticized, and many of the tools are based on it. Then, if you look at Big Five, which is the more kind of robust and predictive in terms of that, also comes under criticism because it is still self-reporting. And that, secondly, when it is deployed, can actually be more punishing towards people because then it's, oh, we perceive that this tool is highly predictive of the outcomes of your behavior. That doesn't take into account the fact that we've proven that our brains are neuroplastic, also older in our lives. So therefore, there is no kind of, you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
Mm.
Your brain is wired to be open to change and has that ability. So that's also there, if we take it purely as predictive, then we say, well, then people cannot change out of their behaviors. That's not true. We can always have that capacity to grow and stretch ourselves.
Now, we've mentioned this meeting we had, and I think it's a little unfair for the listeners to,
Yes.
because we were there. So why was this meeting held? I was just, I mean, I'm interested in psychometrics as a as a concept, so I checked in, but there
Yeah.
was probably 15 people on the call. People were deeply skilled in it, so this was a very rich conversation. And so I guess why was that meeting held, and for you, what was the main
Yeah.
outcomes?
I mean, for me, why it was important, and I would say it's actually something that I would want to keep doing. Um, it's also if you like, one is psychometrics have come under criticism, just like any other tool, not just psychometrics, but any kind of models or tools that we're using to guide business. Whether that's balanced scorecard at some point came, under criticism, or many others that we could actually name. So the second one is it's also a developing field. There's a lot more insights now if you look at what's happening in neuro leadership. We didn't have Stephen Okonoa. He would have also joined the call, but wasn't able to. But he's also been more involved with something called neurocolor. That's also been developed by Dr. Helen Fisher, who and Dave Labno. They actually had developed it based on putting people through MRI scans to be able to see which parts of our brain system actually light up. So it's really kind of going down into the source. So I think for that second reason, then that's important to kind of, stay up to date in terms of what's our evolving understanding about the human brain and how that influences our decisions, our behaviors, the way that we interact with each other. So for me, those were kind of the two main kind of leading reasons of why we wanted to have that conversation.
I think it's, and with the advances of technology, I think the fact that, well, psychology in general,
Mm.
sociology is expanding as we are understanding more about how our brains actually work. So yeah, a great point to that this is evolving. I think MBTI is
Yes.
probably 40 years old, 30, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
it's not a new thing, but
No,
and then there's the different colors and the discs and then the bell
there's
books
disc.
and
Yeah.
there's so many um and what was the outcomes? Because what we
Yeah.
were seeking, and I have the list in front of me, so but
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so then there was four main outcomes of principles, and I think
Yeah.
and what I liked about that was okay, as practitioners of these methods, what are some principles? And I think for me, one of the reasons why a lot of these things start becoming criticized is um, they're used inappropriately. Like
Hmm.
in my world, agile, scrum, safe are criticized. But in my experience, it's so rare that someone actually took the time to understand what the
Yes.
fork it was actually about and
Yes.
what it's not. And somebody
Yes.
comes in and does a mechanical implementation
Yeah.
of we have to show up to these meetings and we have to do these tasks
Oh.
without any understanding of the intention
Yeah.
of of these
Yeah.
activities and ceremonies and practices. And I think a lot of really great ideas are ruined in a way because they're just used inappropriately.
Hmm.
But let's go back
Yeah.
to the principles. Like
Yeah.
what are the highlight principles that came out from this expert group of leadership development people talking about psychometrics? What
Yeah.
are some principles to hold in mind?
I mean, one of them, the one that we were just talking about, Chris, is spot on in terms of like, why are you actually using a psychometric? For what purpose? What do you actually want to get out of it? And when that's not clear, then it can be used kind of inappropriately. And I think that the main kind of principle or conclusion coming out of the group is that there are these are tools that are better used for development than they are for selection. And there is sometimes that tendency of people then get very eager and then they suddenly see their team picture and they're like, oh, then we're missing this and this profile. I'm like, no, that's not the point. Like, you're not going to use this as a way to be able to populate your team because these are not predictive and they're telling you a fraction of well, what this says about what this says about a
Yeah.
person. So I think that's absolutely one of the most crucial things. Like, why are we using it? How do we follow up with it? Especially that it's then not like a one-off, one-time thing. The other thing was actually what we also spoke about earlier, Chris, was like the importance of debriefing.
Yeah.
That it's not something that you just take away for yourself, but actually having somebody, an experienced professional, that can help to debrief that report. And I've seen it many, many times. There are things that a professional can actually take out of a report that are not written in a report
Yeah.
that if you simply read it yourself, you would not be able to get that meaning and understanding because there's experience, because that person connects to and understands you, your team, your context, because there's a moment of reflection and there's asking questions. The richness of that's really what's valuable. The report is an input into it. It's a kind of a documentation. But yeah, that
Mm.
one also that really stood out to me as one of the important things. Plus, what you said also earlier of like you were introduced to psychometrics in a team context, so it actually helped to build understand like curiosity to understand each other, and
Yeah.
kind of moments where I can also ask for forgiveness from others and say, we are all work in progress, and as humans, all of us would want to feel accepted for who we are. And at the same time, we all do need to take some responsibility for the impact of our behavior. You cannot just say, well, you're choosing to feel that way about my behavior. Come on. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, we all have a responsibility to, maybe not take things personally, but also to be able to speak up and say, I can accept you for who you are, but I don't appreciate that or we need to find a different way of relating to that. And I think that's also where it's very powerful in kind of team settings, leadership settings, organizational settings. And I loved what I loved that came out of this conversation was that we kind of landed on use psychometrics to ask better questions, not to give answers. And again, for me, that stayed with me because it was that questioning, the curiosity, the not accepting something as in like a little bit what you also said about, with your MBTI, you kind of may go back to it from time to time, but it doesn't like it's not rigid.
No.
You
But
see yourself
can you go into
develop.
ask better questions, like
Ask better questions.
ask, like, instead of providing answers?
Yeah.
Can you give examples of that? Like, what do you mean?
I mean, for me, it comes down to asking questions to be able to understand each other better,
Mm,
to be able to get to but why is it that you're doing it in that way?
yeah,
Not just staying at like one time why, but like, a little bit like when you say you do like the fishbone exercise or you do like the five whys, we go deeper into being able to get that kind
yeah,
of clarity and understanding. And that really
yeah.
struck me is that it's not then now I have an answer so I can completely understand myself. No, now I have some like a kind of a map that would allow me to continue to explore the territory. And it's like a give and take between those two.
Well, I think for me, it's also looking at understanding myself first as well. So it
Yeah.
also allows me to ask more questions
Yeah.
about myself, and something I've learned over time, in introversion, extroversion, as an energy type of topic, the way I describe it. Um, I love performing on stages, and I love doing workshops and stuff. And I know I will be drained afterwards,
Yeah.
um, I have now the language that I can tell people that say, yes, I'm going to be performing. I'll be rocking it, and I will need to introvert afterwards just to give me some time, just to go, do my thing, read my book, whatever. And I've never taken the tests or do anything with that with my two boys, but I can see one is such an extreme introvert and the other
Yeah.
an extrovert, and you can just watch these conflicts happen. It's just like
Yeah.
like, oh my, okay, so it helps me understand, and then you can start to bring that language in, and and from that also give forgiveness. It's kind of like, okay, we're all tired, and when you're tired you want to talk a lot more, and when you're tired you want to go in a hole, and those things are
Yes.
not compatible. So why don't we forgive each other, and find ways to give each other what we need? And
Absolutely.
yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
it's just it's
Chris, what's very interesting about this, if you look at kind of classical brainstorming, processes or strategizing processes, some of them can be very heavily biased towards extroversion.
oh yes,
And that what that always annoyed me because I also felt that like, what happens is that then the people who have more of a tendency to think out loud, to like think while they're talking, don't give any space for others who actually need some time to first reflect and gather their thoughts and be able to write it down. And actually, both of those ways of thinking are tremendously valuable. There is a tremendous value that even if you're an extroverted thinker, take the time to actually extrovert on a piece of paper with yourself,
mm,
uh, and then be able to bring that as a kind of now I come into the conversation, second generation. And I find that sometimes because people bring groups together or they come together in a meeting, then they feel a meeting has to be all about talking, and actually silence in meetings is golden. Like when we say, okay, there was something sent out ahead of the meeting. Have we had a chance to read that? Okay, rather than talking about something we haven't read, let's take 5 minutes and actually all sit
and read it.
silently
Yeah,
and read that together.
or
Enormous.
postpone the meeting until someone,
Or
until
postpone the
have,
meeting.
yeah,
Yeah, or for
yeah,
example, I've done exercises before when we gather lots of input and we want people to go and absorb that input. And like the energy that comes in a room to have that silence and have people going, reading, thinking, writing their thoughts down before you kind of sit
yeah.
together with and actually extrovert that, it's tremendous. And some people are very scared of it. We don't like silence. We don't like timeouts.
Well,
We don't like breaks.
I wonder
But
if there's a cultural dimension here as well, because I'm going to just be grossly generalizing here, but it's kind of the American English Anglo hierarchical approach, where the more typical A type ESTJ leader
yeah,
dictating as opposed to what I see in the Netherlands, which is much more consensus.
Hmm.
And I don't know, maybe the consensus model, because there is an expectation of interaction. I think, I think
Yeah.
to show up and be silent is kind of not appreciated here. It's like, wait a
Yeah.
second, we all have opinions. What's
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
opinion? And so
Yeah.
there's kind of this invitation of like, okay, we all have to rant and complain and have our opinion before we can get
Have our
on. And
say.
yeah, we all have to have our say.
Yeah.
And I don't know. So maybe there's a balance for um, structurally including introversion in these things, but then
Yeah.
properly facilitated workshops, of course, are designed for this. Okay, let's make
Yes.
sure that the wallflowers are engaged. Let's
Yeah.
ensure that that there's the right time for the right energies and things.
Yes.
Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
But also understanding that in a team, for example, makes it easier for like if I'm an extroverted thinker and I'm with someone who's more of an introverted thinker, then I can also label to them, look, there's something that I would appreciate to have your view on, but I would like to think about, I'd like to share it with you out loud. Is this the right moment to do that? Especially when you're approaching someone and it's outside of a normal meeting context. That makes it then easier to understand of like, are you coming to me with a completed, because if you're an introverted thinker, when you're speaking, you have already completed all your thinking and you're simply stating your conclusion.
yes,
An extroverted thinker is thinking out loud and therefore they're not sharing with you their conclusion yet because they want to get to a conclusion.
yeah.
That can be very confusing because then the introverted thinker is wondering like, is this an opinion? Like, what are you sharing with me? And
Well, it's actually one of the things that I think, and I'm not solely a coach, but when I do engage in coaching, I think my introversion in this one, at least it sets me up for that because I'm
yeah,
listening a lot, and then able to maybe not come up with conclusions, but then look for those unexpected um, queries that could say, like, wait, we seem to be fixed in a certain line of thought here. How can I jiggle this a little bit? And also in that meeting, and which resulted in this podcast conversation, is you mentioned SPI,
yeah,
strategizing preferences indicator, and you mentioned strategizing as a verb. And so what I
yes,
would love to do is, okay, can you introduce us to SPI?
yeah,
And because I'm just very curious about these things, I said, please let me do it. Let me do it. And we now have my results, if you will,
yeah.
the outcome, the output. So can you introduce SPI
Yeah.
and how you use this psychometric in the strategizing process?
Mm,
And then I'd like to open it up a little bit and see
awesome.
what do we see about me? What questions can we ask about me
Yeah.
from this?
Yeah. Yeah. I think before we look at your results, I think it's just stepping back and saying like, what is the SPI all about and what
Yeah,
is
what is
it?
SPI? How do
It's,
you use it in
yeah.
strategizing processes? Why does it
Yeah.
exist?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then
And
then
actually,
we'll pop it open and say, okay, this is who Chris is.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was developed by Michael, so who you met, well, you know him already for some time, and specifically what it's actually looking at is it's diving into dimensions that are most relevant for problem solving because strategizing is essentially also problem solving. Whether or you could call it problem solving or opportunity creation, depending on the point of view that
Mm-hmm.
you want to take. And it is Jungian based tool. So then you can see then the connection to, for example, MBTI, which is also Jungian based. It takes kind of the two of those dimensions. And the first dimension, it has to do with, what's the kind of information that we like? How do we like to receive information? How do we trust the information? And then there can be more of a preference towards the sensing. Am I taking it through all of my five senses and very factual, very literate, very concrete, very realistic? Or am I more on the intuition side that I like to take things in from big picture, like to see connections, I like to hear the bigger story. Sometimes communication style means that if I'm leaning more towards the sensing preference, I will communicate sequentially. Whereas for an intuition preference, I may communicate more broadly, like big picture, before I actually go into details. And of course, if I say it this way, every human has five senses. So we live in the world of senses. We all do it. And we also live in the world that if
Mm.
I, showed you a painting, most of us would be able to also not only describe the painting and the colors and what's there, but we could also maybe draw some conclusion out of it. How does the painting make me feel? How do I think it could make me feel? Is it telling me a story? Who is the artist behind this? Doing that kind of exploration. The second dimension it's looking at is looking at our attitude to the external world. How do we orient ourselves? Do I go into the world and I look for options and I see all kinds of possibilities and connections and etc. Or am I going into the world and I see there's decisions that I need to take and I need to bring order into the world. And where that shows up also in terms of teams working together is that if you're more on the order side, then maybe your approach also towards a project is that you work towards a project deadline in a very kind of sequential, organized, even finishing before the deadline. Whereas somebody with more of a, open preference, kind of a perceiving, exploring type of a preference would, I don't know, be like a bumblebee, go around and then finally, like in this
Mm.
burst of stress and energy, be able to deliver. That can cause tension within teams in terms of how we problem solve. Now there's, benefits and if you start early, you actually have, more time or more space but you could also close yourself off from other information or other input, progressive insights that could actually be relevant. And if you're too much at the last minute, you could, maybe not get the best result that you could have gotten at the level if you had actually been more organized. So these two dimensions, what you actually see back in your report is depending on how you were answering the statements, it was kind of seeing on which side, is it up and down or is it kind of left or right? And then what you get back in the report is where is it that is your dominant preference, kind of your starting point. And we have a colleague who describes it. You'll see it in the colors. Is she often then says your preferences are a rainbow. So you have your dominant, you have your secondary, then there's your tertiary, and then there's the inferior. And usually the fourth one is where we are maybe less comfortable, or when we're under stress, it's not the
Yeah.
thing that's immediately going to pop up.
So, and when you're in an engagement, working with a leadership team, strategizing for,
Yeah.
realizing breakthroughs, as we said,
Yeah.
say there's like 6, 8 people in that leadership team. How would you use this in what context, and like what happens when and if I remember right, this is like 12, 15 questions. It's not a huge
Yeah,
thing.
it's like 20 statements.
Yeah.
Basically. So it's not,
it
yeah.
went by super quick.
Yeah.
So can you describe how you would use it in reality with the team?
So usually we'd invite everyone on the team to take, to complete the questionnaire the same way that you did. And then what we do is that in a live session, whether that's, being done online or kind of being done live face to face, we actually first start with debriefing. And so we would debrief that first by, the explanation that I gave you. So if I was, doing that live, then I have some visuals to support it. I ask people to kind of reflect and think about that. I have this nice exercise that also I've seen used for, other preference tools is like, which hand do you write with? So what's your dominant hand? So I'm right-handed. So if I'm going to put the pen suddenly in my left hand, I'm not skilled at that. It's not my preference, because I haven't trained it, then I'm not as good at it.
Yeah.
And my mom, for example, left-handed, went to a French Catholic school at the time where they were still, beating you and punishing you for being left-handed. So she's actually ambidextrous. She can write equally well with both her hands. And to this day, she still tells me, yeah, I still prefer my left hand. She will, do things with her left hand just simply because there's a preference. So
Mm.
there's a little bit of that understanding. Then there's inviting everybody, take some time, read through your report, and because it's self-reporting, as nearly all psychometrics are self-reporting, there's also a little bit of, validation of, do I actually recognize myself? Or maybe some people were in a moment of stress, or, what other circumstances were happening around them. Usually I find that the majority all say like, yes, I recognize myself either a lot Or, okay, maybe it's a little bit nuanced. What's interesting then is to actually see the team picture. To
Yeah.
then say, where are we all in relation to each other? Then often what I'd love to do, Chris, is to say, okay, what if we put ourselves under stress right now, here in this room? We give ourselves a problem. It's a problem that has nothing to do with our context. And what's good about that is that therefore nobody is going to be the expert. We're not going to fall into our usual trap of technical content and, all of the weight and history and patterns. But it's simply a problem that we need to solve together. There's a goal that we need to define, we need to meet, and we need to figure that out and do it immediately under pressure. It's so interesting to actually then have such a setup like that, because then often what happens is that when we're under pressure, we revert immediately to our default preferences.
So you run
So
a,
when
a
people,
simulation activity right there, put them under
yeah.
stress, and then process that. Great.
And
Yeah.
then we process that. And what's really interesting is when we start processing that, we start having a conversation about what do we think went well and why. Not from the content, because the content doesn't matter. It's a puzzle, it's an activity, it's a challenge. We're not going to necessarily face that type of problem again, but we are going to be under pressure and we are going
Yep.
to be problem solving. So
Mm.
what do we actually learn from that in terms of how we're interacting and how we're figuring out what is the goal what is not only the problem, but what kind of a goal are we going to set? Do we have an ambition to that goal? Is the goal, for example, we're just going to answer the two questions, or is the goal we're going to answer the two questions faster than anyone in the room, like other teams in the room, or faster than,
Yeah.
Araz, you've seen other people do this. I rarely then get asked, what's the fastest this has ever been done? What could then be, our level of ambition towards that? And there's, of course, always a question around, well, how did you notice? Like, if you think now of your preferences report, and if you look at others, where did you see that coming in? And sometimes then people who have like the improviser preference will say, well, we got the puzzle and then we immediately started like, without even looking at instructions again, started picking things up, started getting into action, started playing around.
Yeah.
Whereas, somebody else with perhaps an optimizer preference is sitting there reading a brief in very detail and is bullet point like, making sense of it. So I think that's where it becomes
And
very interesting.
and
Yeah.
what are some patterns? Like imagine, there's these six people and you had a good spread of
Yeah.
preferences, or you had six people and they were all in one zone of preference,
Yeah.
or there's a lot of visionaries and then one outlier. Like
Yeah.
what do you do with these realizations then?
Yeah. Yeah. What we do with those realizations is a couple of things. And I think, and that's where it helps in kind of using this in a longer term engagement, because then there's several moments that we can actually come back to it. It's looking at, what does this mean in terms of takeaways that we have for kind of principles of how we work together. And that often that's a kind of a contracting. So we contract and we agree with each other. Here's what we could actually do differently. Here's maybe what we should continue doing. Here's what we should stop doing. And then it gives a kind of an anchor to then say, in
Mm.
the next management meeting, I can look back at it and say, how do we think we're actually doing? We had these insights. We've contracted these things with each other. When we've actually done this, has it actually helped us? Because I think that's also the important thing is like
Yeah.
we can agree on a ritual and then we shouldn't just be doing the ritual for the ritual's sake. It's like what you said earlier that like people implement agile like, and they just focus on like the ritual, but not like or meditation and you're not getting anything out of it. Well,
Yeah.
because you're not actually doing, or you should be looking at actually doing something different. So I think that's
Yeah.
also an important part of the conversation is saying, are we seeing that this ritual is helping us? Is it making an impact in terms of the quality of our decision, the speed of our decisions, the environment that we feel we're creating for ourselves and for our team, our ability to respond to changes that are happening in the market. Those
And,
are all ways of kind of assessing it. Did
and
I
I think,
answer your
yeah, I
question?
think these are things that wouldn't be normally self-evident or self-emerging from a six people who have very different preferences, or even if they all have the same preference, because they're all probably getting along famously and then have
Yeah,
these huge gaps in potential.
yeah.
Um, and then if
I
you're,
saw,
yeah,
sorry, I interrupted you.
well, I guess in order to codify that to say, okay, well, because we acknowledge our strong preferences over here on visionary, um, maybe we do need to codify in some of these. Okay, let's take 5 minutes to read the brief, before the meeting, and these are things that might emerge, maybe because one person has an idea for it, but in this case, it gives them some sort of grounding and some basis to say, hey, this is the intention, this is the why that we're going to have this, let's call it ritual or ceremony. No,
Yeah.
yeah, cool.
Yeah. I anecdotally, I was recently using it with a team that I have. I'm seeing them every kind of quarter or so. And they're all senior people have been in, but it's a kind of a new collective. So it's a new team
Mm.
that's forming and coming together. And they had, spread across the preferences, but several of them who were dominant improviser. And then one of the things that I kind of mirrored back to them, and then they said to me, you know what? The day before, when they were in a meeting, they had been, looking at what are some of the strategic choices that we're making. And then they got to the end of the day and they deprioritized prioritization.
They deprioritize. Like what? Yeah.
They had their options and they had all, and then they said, we're not going to prioritize spending time on prioritizing what we should prioritize, which I told them, do you
Wow.
recognize that that's a bias in your team in terms of, and it was kind of like the light bulb going on. Oh my God, we just walked like into, our preference that we were all comfortable, we were all okay with leaving. Whereas if you had had a few more optimizer or visionary in the room, they may have felt more uncomfortable with saying, guys, or at least we should leave agreeing on which date and in which configuration, and by when does this actually need to be done. So then we were forced on that moment to then agree, okay, guys, this is actually important because we do need to give clarity to the rest of the organization of what are the things that we are not going to do and what are the things that we do want to give energy to pursue and how are we going to measure and learn from them, and we can go back to those other things on a backlog. Improvisers would generally be okay with that level of ambiguity,
Yeah.
but you cannot manage an organization purely with your preference
Yeah.
because
No.
there's
Yeah. And I don't think we've described it, but it's a 2x2,
right.
matrix. There's and top left is visionary, top right explorer, top or bottom is left is optimizer, and bottom
Yeah,
right is improviser. And there's blue, green, yellow, red colors.
just to get
There's a
some spice
little
to it.
diamond where your default position is, and then there's a dotted line within this, which is the zone of comfort, as it's called. So,
Yeah.
um, I'm curious with myself, and what I'll do is I will put this image on the show notes, so if people want to go take a look at it, and just so because it's kind of abstract if you're talking about 2x2 matrices
True. Yeah.
without seeing it.
Yeah.
Um, and I am, let me see if I can describe this, bottom left of the explorer. So I'm on
Yeah.
the top right quadrant, but I'm the bottom left of that. So I'm really close to the center of this square. And then the dotted line is pretty wide around that. So it's but a little
Yeah.
to the north, I
A
guess.
little bit wider upwards. Yeah.
And it says my first preference is explore, second is visionary. So that's top right, top left.
Mhm.
And my find it harder to use is that optimizer because that's the furthest away from where
Yeah.
my diamond default position is.
Mhm.
Um, what does this mean? So like when I see it, because when I've done these things before, there's well, let me tell you what, when I first looked at this, is it was quite close to the center. And when I've done other psychometric stuff, I find myself not extreme. So
Mm.
I'm kind of tending towards the gravitational middle a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm just a pattern that I see um a lot, and as far as the explorer in my personality, yes, you could call me an adventurer, architect
Mm.
adventure type person. So like, yes, I'm drawn to that term anyways, so maybe that's my own bias. I don't
Hey,
know.
that's why.
Yeah. So like, all right, I'm happy with that. Don't know what it means, but I want to go and explore something. So, um, but I when I read through the report, I'm like, okay, yes, I can see this, but like as you said, it does need more processing. Maybe the so what behind it, And there
Yeah.
are 2 pages afterwards, 2 3 pages that go into the explorer, which is called the adaptable promoter, and then visionary is the visionary decision maker. um, I think I would tend to be more explorer just by those terms as well.
Mm.
And then it talks about that they're best at create global concepts and connections, embrace and enable change, are authentic, see hidden and unimagined possibilities, flexibility, generate options before deciding, embrace freedom for self and other, like hell yeah.
Yeah.
When I read that, like tick, 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 and then when I'm going crazy, you can become rebellious, fear of unimagined, problems. And, it goes into the dark side. It's really interesting to see. But um, when you saw this representation of me at that moment in time, through
Mm.
this vehicle, um, what are a few things that you would shout out?
Yeah. I mean, a few things, Chris. I think one is when you showed me when we looked at that picture together, based on my interactions and how we know each other, I also recognized that. And I do recognize, I mean, that's also what's interesting about your zone of comfort is, you have a relatively wide zone of comfort because you were kind of using all different parts of the scale while you were responding to the statements. Versus some other people can have a more narrow zone of comfort. But your zone of comfort stretches further into the, visionary explorer, which I also recognize because in terms of, all of what you bring also to different organizations and to, work that we've also done together is to be able to then create new, explore, create for the future, identify, new paths forward for, and it could be for existing products or for new products or new services and new innovation. And you're always, out there saying like, what if I tried this, or what if I tried that, or what if I got curious
Hmm.
around this? I think what also in terms of the visionary, there's probably that connection of I'm living in the world of possibilities, but the visionary is actually bringing a framework. And probably part of that is also what you've learned. So
Hmm.
you've kind of developed like it's kind of a preference that you're getting over time. Because being able to work in organizations, you also do need to have a filter to actually a framework to be able to filter and to take decisions and to say, well, I have options, but I cannot make everybody go after all of the different options. And then I would say for your third one, then at some point it becomes real of like, how do I experiment and how do I make that happen? And if I think, Chris, of the work that we've done, for example, on customer journeys, like there is that exploration side of the customer journey, yet you also bring that back into what does that mean in terms of overall governance? What does that mean in terms of how you collect data? Like there's that framework that connects to it, which gives direction to experiments. It also allows us to then be able to evaluate, how are those experiments working? I'm thinking that if maybe when you have in the past or would in the future encounter people who have a dominant optimizer preference and that sits maybe outside of your zone of comfort, that it could kind of feel like that tension between, somebody who is more, starts with reality, starts with why the hell are we going to start doing something
Hmm.
different? Excuse my language, but when it's been proven that it's been successful, there's stability to that. There's something that we need to leverage and exploit even more going forward. If you're, coming up with some idea that I don't see connected to reality today, you don't know what the hell you're actually talking about. I don't know if you have encountered that in the past. I know that that's also not my preference, so I think we kind of are more similar in terms of preferences. But that could also create kind of tension.
Well, I'm thinking of a particular person, and she was a head of operations, and indeed, we had very different opinions about things.
Yeah.
We're also able to do it in a very mature way, which was good. And I think also in my own career path, I've been, because also what I see, because I'm kind of navigating in the middle, I'm also kind of a professional generalist, meaning I can adapt to a lot of different things. I'm not sure if it has to do with this type of preference, but I think it's generally a true statement. But I do tend towards times of change, so
Yeah.
Like when people call me and, and it just even it happened the other day, I was called for an opportunity, and one of the things I describe is if you're looking for someone to squeak out a few percentages of efficiency over the next
Hmm.
3 years, I'm not that person.
Yeah.
I am not that person. If you want to change, do you want to transform, do you want to break, do you want to rebuild, if you want to move in new directions, I'm absolutely your person. And so
Yeah.
there's, because I'm also aware that there are much better people suited for that really important job that is just not me.
Yeah.
And I think what I would have also through this when I come in, because I work oftentimes in IT digital data stuff, is it's so easy to criticize the past,
Mm.
but realize that the past was made by people that have these different preferences, and there was a really good reason back then why this decision was made, because
Yeah.
people typically don't run around making bad decisions on purpose.
Yeah.
And I think, so the technology maybe is no longer fit for a purpose, but that's more because the time has changed. And
Hmm.
what I find is the people who are responsible for these long-term technologies are typically optimizers, meaning
Mm.
it's been built 15 years ago, and the people still hanging out are the hardcore optimizers that are just, really keeping it stable.
Yeah.
And they have, blood, sweat, and tears baked into this thing. And then you have to come in and say, well, actually, we're going to kill your darling. Well, yeah, expect a
And replace it with
reaction,
what,
expect a reaction,
Yeah.
and you better have your case very strong, because they've been literally working on this for 15 years, and they will know it by far better than you ever will. So there's yeah no there's self-awareness here for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You know what, Chris, I was also thinking of what you were just saying about people. I think there's also people who live in, well, I mean, we all live in reality, but if you're starting with dominant optimizer, then I also notice that there's sometimes this, when there's a contrast to it, it's kind of then feeling, oh, okay, we tried that in the past, it didn't work. And I actually think that that should be an invitation to then further explore, like to not take that as a negative remark,
Hmm.
but to then say, if we have tried something in the past and it didn't work, let's make sure that we've really understood why it didn't work.
Yeah.
What were we actually trying to doing? And because if we are then trying to do something that looks similar to what we've done in the past, have enough of the circumstances changed, or are we actually going to do something fundamentally different, that could actually give a new way or a new path or a new, because I think that, and I think sometimes people can then say, well, people with an optimizer, that's a very negative thing to say. And that isn't, it's our interpretation of thinking that it's negative. There's wisdom there of saying that there is some
Well,
learning from the past,
yeah.
and we should actually try to understand why is the system now the way that it is. Because you see that, like I remember with a big food retailer, they had this massive system change and data migration. And what happened is that there was, certain voices that were not listened to. And then when it went live, it didn't work. Then as a retailer, you are stuck. You cannot get goods in and out of your warehouses, of your stores. I mean, it was a massive, a huge scandal. So there's a huge benefit for that energy, and for that stability on key processes, that we
Well,
should make sure the preferences are there, but also, like, even if the preference isn't there, let's not underestimate the importance of that on critical infrastructure.
well, um, I think in our world, like the McKinsey statement that 80% of transformations fail, and people are saying that 90% of AI projects fail. Um, Something I'd love to bring into those conversations is maybe a lot of those should never have started, because
Yeah.
they're just bad ideas.
Yeah.
And some of these people that are, like, this voice of reason in the organization, you can call them, saboteurs, or, you know, resistance to change, or, corporate immune system. And sometimes they're right.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes that, from that wisdom, that they are really, calling it, and,
Yeah,
and, and I that sometimes there's this lazy leadership versus what I call love leadership, and sometimes that love leadership is hard because you gotta really sit down and listen and embrace to people that have a different opinion than you.
Yeah.
And okay, well, tell me more. It makes me feel uncomfortable. Everything about this conversation makes me feel comfortable, but I will live in my discomfort so I can understand you, because maybe intuitively I know there's a nugget of truth in there.
Yeah.
And it's really important. And it's hard work. I think I'm more of a lazy leadership is like, oh yeah, he's just a troublemaker.
Yeah.
And then you have this major scandal where your core systems don't work.
Yeah.
It comes down to leadership. So in the spirit of wrapping up, if people out there are inspired by this and they're going through their strategizing process and they're like, well, actually, it would be really cool if we had some more insights into our preferences of strategizing.
Yeah.
How could they do that? So like where can they embark on this?
I think probably the easiest is to kind of get in touch for a conversation, to then understand, because I think I speak for myself and for my colleagues, we always want to make sure that, if I go back to the principles, does it make sense to be using this in this moment?
Yeah.
Let's just not get excited about like, ooh, this is something new and shiny, and let's do it. Because there are some times where you say, well, actually, now is not the moment. It's not the right setup. It doesn't make, sense. So I would say it first starts with a conversation to say, hey, let's talk about what's actually happening, why you got excited about it, how could we actually see it, and could we actually give follow-up to it? That it's something that, we don't just take it as one-off, but something that we could actually return. We would have the commitment as a team to kind of return back to and reflect on further.
Yeah,
that would be my suggestion. Yeah.
And going back to the principles, have a very clear reason.
Yes.
I think also have guidance on these things, so don't self-administer them. And, I think having a coach or a trained external kind of Sherpa on the way can help things going, keep things going.
I am learning. I mean, there are evolutions that are happening in AI coaching. So maybe, there will also be kind of an AI coaching that will, be able to get to that level. I don't know. But I would say certainly, not debriefing these things on your own. I would not do that in this.
No, not yet. But I can imagine the AI would eventually get there, but not yet. But even then, make sure it's a well-trained AI, in a proper process. You're using it for the right reason. So, but you can get a hold of Araz it's elpnetwork.com. I'll include that in the show notes, and also Araz Najarian on LinkedIn. I'll keep her link in the show notes as well. And so, no, fascinating. I was really positively triggered by the engagement with the ELP group, talking about this stuff. And then when those principles came out, I'm like, oh, we have to have this conversation. And then
I'm glad you reached out.
Yeah. And then I also said, well, let me do this SPI thing and let's process this in the podcast, which some people might say is a bit vulnerable, but I think it adds a level of richness, for the listener, for me, for certainly, hey, I just got an expert, review of my SPI preferences, but I think it also provides a richness for people to understand what it actually is and how it relates to someone, and how you could actually use it for a benefit of the individual and also the organization. So elpnetwork.com, Araz Najarian, thank you so much for this. This has been
thanks, Chris.
This has been great.
Yeah, for me too.
Thank you for listening to the Business Simplicity podcast. If this conversation resonated, please share it with a fellow leader navigating complexity. Visit ebullient.com to discover how we can partner to simplify your strategy, align your teams, and accelerate meaningful growth.